There is this phrase that keeps popping up in headlines about Venezuela. America's eye is on oil. And every single time I see it, I can't help but think, come on, does anyone really believe this is just about oil or just about drugs? Here's what's actually weird. America is producing more oil than ever, record amounts. We're talking numbers that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago, and yet every single day, the US is importing millions of barrels from other countries as well. If that doesn't make sense to you, good, it shouldn't, because the answer to why rivals something way bigger than just oil. So stick with me in this video, because what I'm about to show you explains why gas prices do what they do, why certain countries suddenly matter more than others, and why the politicians giving you simple answers are either lying or don't understand the game themselves. We're going to answer 3 questions. Why does America import oil when it's drowning in the stuff? How did Venezuela, a country that most people can't even find on a map, end up holding cards nobody wants to admit exists? And who actually has the power in all of this? Quick question for Canadians watching. When politicians talk about energy security, do you trust them? Or does it feel like they're reading from a script with half the pages missing? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I genuinely want to understand what you're thinking about this. Just a quick personal note, my new book, Awake, the Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Soft-Lies, is finally out in the world now. It's more than just a guide to thinking more clearly. It's about finding calm and clarity in a world that keeps getting louder. If you've ever felt like I do, worn down by the noise and knee-jerk opinions and want practical ways to think things through, especially under pressure, I think you'll find it valuable. Or if you know somebody who could use that kind of support right now, it might actually make a thoughtful Christmas gift. There's also a 24-minute companion podcast that walks through the key ideas, plus a launch video and a special discount for subscribers, all linked down below. And one more thing, maybe you didn't know, but I'm a computer scientist and I have a PhD in the field. I'm working on a new course all about AI fluency, essentially making sense of the technology that's shaping the next decade. If you're interested in this space and want to help guide what I build, I'd love to have your input. There's a quick 8-question survey, just a couple of minutes to fill out, and your thoughts will directly influence the content that I build next. The links to everything are below. It would mean so much to hear from you. Thank you for listening, but now let's get back into it. Okay, so here's the thing that everyone gets wrong about American oil independence. Yes, America is producing insane amounts of oil. The shale revolution happened, fracking technology kicked off in places like North Dakota and Texas, and suddenly the US went from being the world's biggest oil addict to being the world's biggest oil producer. That part's absolutely true. The numbers are staggering. We're talking about going from importing 60% of oil to producing more than America can consume in less than 2 decades. But here's what they don't tell you, that not all oil is the same. I know that that sounds obvious when I say it like that, but this is the detail that changes absolutely everything, and it's the part that gets left out of every political speech, every press conference, every cable news segment about energy dependence. There are basically 3 types of crude oil. Light oil, thin, almost see-through, flows like water. It's easier to refine, cleaner, less sulfur content. Then there is a medium crude, the dark, thick stuff you probably picture when you think of oil. And then there's the heavy crude, black, gloopy, viscous like tar, the kind that sticks to everything, that's harder to extract, harder to transport, harder to refine. Now here's where it gets interesting. America's shale boom was almost all of it in light oil. That's what comes out of those rock formations when you use fracking technology. It's great oil, don't get me wrong, but it is light. And here's the problem that nobody wants to talk about. America's refineries, those massive industrial complexes you see sprawling across the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, the ones that look like something out of a sci-fi movie, you know what I'm talking about. They were not built for light oil. They were built decades ago, back when America was producing heavy crude domestically, back when imports from Venezuela and Mexico were the norm, and everything flowing through those refineries was thick, heavy, sulfurous crude. The whole system, the pipes, the processing equipment, the catalytic crackers, the caulking units, everything was designed and optimized for thick, heavy oil. And here is what makes this a real problem. You can't just swap one type for another. It's not like putting regular gas in a car that takes premium, where it might run a little rough, but it still works. Refineries are precision built for a specific type of crude. The chemistry is different, the processing is different, the equipment needed is different. Retrofitting a refinery to efficiently handle light crude instead of heavy crude, we're talking billions of dollars here. Multiple years of construction. And the kicker is that even after you spend all that money and time, you actually lose efficiency on the heavy crude that you might still want to process. So what happened is this. American companies looked at that equation and said, you know what? It's actually cheaper to keep importing heavy crude and refining it the way that we've always done it, and then just export our light crude to other countries whose refineries are set up for it. Which brings us to the absolutely wild statistic that changes how you see everything. Back in the early 2000s, only about 12% of America's oil imports were heavy crude. Most of it was light and medium grays that American refineries could handle. But today that number is 70%. Let that sink for a second. America is producing record amounts of oil, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, and at the exact same time, it's importing more heavy crude than it has ever had in history. That's not a failure of energy politics. That's not politicians being stupid. That's just physics meeting infrastructure. That's the reality of a system built over decades that can't pivot on a dime just because the geology changed. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, that's interesting in a nerdy kind of way, but why should I actually care about refinery chemistry and oil types? Fair enough. Here's why. This is the reason your gas prices spike when they do. Think about what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. Suddenly, Russian oil, a huge chunk of global heavy crude supply, got cut off by sanctions. European refineries that were designed for Russian Urals crude were scrambling. The global heavy crude market got tight overnight. And what happened to gas prices in America? They shot up as well. Not because there was no oil, not because America wasn't producing enough, but because there wasn't enough of the right kind of oil flowing to the refineries that supply your local gas station. When heavy crude supplies get disrupted, whether it's Russia getting sanctioned or a pipeline in Canada getting delayed or political chaos in Venezuela shutting down their exports, American refineries can't just flip a switch and say, okay, we'll just use more American light crude instead. They literally cannot process it efficiently. Their equipment isn't designed for it. Their whole setup is optimized for heavy grades. So what happens? They have to bid against everyone else in the world for whatever heavy crude is available. Prices go up as a result, refining margins get squeezed, and eventually that flows all the way to the price you actually pay at the pump. This is also why you'll see this weird phenomenon where US oil production hits a record high and gas prices also hit record highs. It seems contradictory until you understand this fundamental mismatch. America is producing the wrong type for its own infrastructure. Here's where it gets actually political really fast. Every time a politician stands up and promises you energy independence, this is the part they're conveniently leaving out. America can produce all the light oil in the world, and it is. They're exporting massive amounts of it. But until somebody spends tens of billions of dollars retrofitting refineries, which nobody wants to do really because it's expensive as hell and economically risky, the US is kind of stuck needing heavy crude from somewhere else. And when you look at the global map of who produces heavy crude at scale, your options get actually very limited really fast. You've got Canada, great partner, but pipeline capacity is maxed out and politically contentious. You've got Russia, well, we know how that's going. You've got Mexico, but their production has been declining for years. You've got some Middle Eastern producers, but shipping costs make that less ideal. And then, the holy grail, you've got Venezuela, sitting there with the largest oil reserves on planet Earth. Almost all of it is heavy crude, exactly what America needs. Let's talk about Venezuela for a minute, because this is where the story gets really strange. If you pull up a map of global proven oil reserves, something absolutely jumps out at you. Venezuela has more oil than anyone else on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than Canada, Russia, literally anyone. We're talking about roughly 300 billion barrels of proven reserves. And the kicker is that almost all of it is heavy crude. The Orinoco Belt, which is where most of Venezuela's oil sits, produces some of the heaviest crude in the world. It's exactly, precisely, perfectly matched to what American Gulf Coast refineries were designed to handle. On paper, this should be a perfect match. Geography works. Venezuela is much closer to Gulf Coast refineries than Middle Eastern suppliers, for example. The crude quality works. It's what their refineries want. The reserves are massive, enough to supply US needs for decades. But here's where reality gets complicated. Despite having all of this oil, Venezuela has basically vanished from US import charts. In the early 2000s, Venezuela was one of the top suppliers to the US, sending over 1 million barrels a day. Today, it's essentially zero. So what happened? Well, a combination of things. Chavez came to power and started nationalizing the oil industry, kicking out foreign expertise. Then Maduro took over and things got even worse. Corruption, mismanagement, lack of investment in infrastructure, the whole production apparatus started falling apart. Then US sanctions came in, cutting off the relationship entirely. So American refineries adapted. They turned more towards Canada. Canadian heavy crude from the oil sands became the go-to replacement, and Venezuela kind of faded into the background of the conversation. Except, not really. Here's what's fascinating. If you actually talk to people in the energy industry, traders, refinery engineers, policy strategists, Venezuela never actually leaves the conversation. It's actually always there. This ghost at every negotiating table, this option that nobody wants to talk about publicly, but everyone knows is just sitting there. Because here's the reality of the situation. Canada is a great partner, but Canadian heavy crude production has limits. The oil sands are expensive to develop, environmentally controversial, and pipeline capacity to get that oil to US refineries is maxed out. There are political battles in both Canada and the US over every new pipeline proposal. Russia, well, that's obviously not a viable long-term option given current geopolitics. Mexico's heavy crude production from Cantarell and other fields has been in decline for years. Middle Eastern producers can supply heavy crude, but shipping it across the Atlantic or through the Panama Canal adds costs and time. But if you're doing strategic planning for a long-term heavy crude supply, if you're a refinery operator looking 10, 20 years down the line, if you're a policymaker thinking about energy security, there's really only one answer that checks all of the boxes: Venezuela. Close by, massive reserves, exactly the right type of crude, existing infrastructure that could be brought back online with investment. And that's why every few months you see these weird headlines: US considering easing Venezuela sanctions, secret talks between US and Venezuela officials, US grants oil license to Chevron for Venezuela operations. The public narrative is always about democracy promotion or fighting drug trafficking or humanitarian concerns. And sure, those things are real, I'm not saying no. But trace the incentives here, follow the actual strategic logic. America needs heavy crude. Venezuela has more heavy crude than anyone else on earth. Just do the math. Venezuela knows that America needs it. That's a power dynamic nobody really wants to say out loud. Now, this next part makes people really uncomfortable because it contradicts the narrative we're used to hearing about American power. The US is the most powerful country on earth, largest economy, strongest military, most advanced technology, and as of right now, the biggest oil producer in the world. And yet, when it comes to this one specific thing, heavy crude supply for Gulf Coast refineries, it's stuck. Not powerless, but stuck. Stuck in a system built decades ago that can't change without massive investment. Stuck needing something from a rotating cast of countries that it would rather not depend on. Think about the absurdity of this for just a second. The US produces more oil than it consumes. It's a net exporter of petroleum products, and yet it's still strategically dependent on imports from countries whose politics it doesn't like, whose governments it doesn't trust, whose values it doesn't necessarily share. This is not hypocrisy. It's not really a contradiction. It's just what happens when infrastructure built for one reality meets a completely different reality, and the cost of changing it is so high that everyone just kind of adapts to the dysfunction instead. When Russia invaded Ukraine and Russian oil got sanctioned, the entire global heavy crude market shifted overnight. Prices spiked, European refineries scrambled to find alternatives, we all remember this, and where did the conversation immediately go? Venezuela. The Biden administration started quietly allowing some Venezuelan oil back into the market. Sanctions got selectively eased. Chevron got permission to resume operations. Not because anything fundamentally changed about Venezuela's government. The regime is still authoritarian. All the original justifications for sanctions still exist. But the math changed. The operations narrowed, and suddenly the strategic calculation shifted. This is what drives me absolutely crazy about the public debate around this stuff. Politicians talk about energy policy like it's simple, like it's a matter of will, of values, of standing up for what's right. We're going to achieve energy independence. We're not going to buy oil from dictators. We're going to stand up for democracy in Latin America. All beautiful values, great slogans. They sound amazing in speeches, but they run headfirst into the reality that America built a refining system optimized for heavy crude. The system can change quickly, and the list of countries who produce heavy crude at scale includes a lot of places American politicians would rather not depend on. So instead of being honest about that tension, instead of having a real conversation about trade-offs, like we're actual adults, and strategic choices, we get this weird kabuki theater where official policy says one thing and actual behavior does something completely different. Venezuela gets sanctioned for human rights and democracy concerns, but also gets exempt from those sanctions when heavy crude supplies get tight. Canada gets praised as a reliable partner, and I think that it is, but pipelines get blocked by environmental concerns. Russia gets condemned as an adversary, but European refineries kept buying Russian oil until they absolutely couldn't anymore. None of this is about hypocrisy or corruption or bad faith. It's about the gap between the system we have and the system we pretend to have, between the flexibility we need and the infrastructure we're stuck with. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this. Next time you see a headline about Venezuela or gas prices or energy policy or any politician promising energy independence, I want you to ask yourself one question. What's the thing that they are not saying? because the story you're being told is almost never the full story. It's the version that's easy to explain, easy to sell, easy to fit into whatever political narrative someone is trying to push that week. The real story is in the refineries that were built 40 years ago and can't change without billions of dollars and years of work. It's in the chemistry of different crude types that most people have never really thought about. It's in the pipeline capacity that everyone takes for granted until it's just not there. It's in the fact that sometimes the most powerful country in the world finds itself constrained by decisions made decades before most of us were born. Infrastructure has inertia, my friends. Systems have momentum. And changing either of those things is way harder and far more expensive than anyone wants to actually admit. This doesn't mean we're helpless, of course not. It doesn't mean policy doesn't matter. But it does mean that the distance between here's what we should do and here's what we actually can do is often a lot bigger than the campaign speeches suggest. To the Canadians watching, now that you know all of this, do you actually trust the stories you're being told about energy security? Or does this whole thing make you realize how much is left unsaid in those official statements? A disciplined mind doesn't need all the answers, but it needs to know when it's not getting the full question. And on energy policy, on the real reasons behind seemingly strange geopolitical relationships, I'd say we're usually not even getting half the question. If you want to go deeper on this stuff, do check out these other videos that I've linked here as a natural next step for a deeper dive. Thank you for sticking with me through this complexity. The stuff is not simple, I know, and anyone who tells you that it is either doesn't understand it or is just trying to sell you something. And if this made you think differently about something you thought you understood, hit that subscribe button. The House of L is a community for people who'd rather sit with a hard question than pretend to have an easy answer. You're more than welcome here.